Racist officers brutally arrest black man outside his home. Regret it when his identity emerges. Right outside his house, police officers mercilessly beat a black man degrading. He in front of his children and wife, they were unable to identify this man. Truly was, and the results of their activities were catastrophic. Subscribe to the channel so you miss fresh articles and leave comments on Eric Brooks's fingertips. Gripped around the leather steering wheel as his automobile cruised down the peaceful tree-lined streets of Upmarket. Though the day had been lengthy, victorious, yet another case 1A. Corruption scandal involving a high-rank in police officer ultimately brought to jail for Eric. Events like these, though each victory reminded him exactly how far the system had gone, bittersweet success in the courtroom was fulfilling. To go and how often, despite his esteemed profession, his achievements were eclipsed by his skin tone. The sleek black vehicle stopped before his two-story house, a modern masterpiece tucked away among other multi-million-dollar features. The dull glow the porch lights created on the road going to the front door, where Eric's wife Sarah would most likely be reading a book. Their two children, Jordan and Maya, would be quick slept upstairs as Eric reached to switch off the engine. The abrupt flash of brilliant headlights blinded him, then the strong glare of blue and red police. His heart rate surged with a familiar yet unwanted sensation that flowed over every time he spotted flashing lights behind him, regardless of his innocence, echoed in the harsh metallic clang of a police cruiser door closing. Eric gazed peacefully into the rearview mirror, his pulse racing as two uniformed police stroking hands on their holsters had shadows on their faces. He lived under the streetlights. This was his neighborhood, his driveway here. Car, yet here they were prepared to take the harshest action from the one of. Before Eric even got to the car, the cops yelled. His instincts warned him. He relaxed so he wouldn't move quickly. He removed his seatbelt. Slowly, his attorney's legal consciousness already racing with the ramifications of what was license and registration. The second officer shot pictures of. My house is this. Eric gently opened the door and walked out, hands raised slightly to indicate he wasn't a threat. Eric started, his voice steady but firm. I'm just dragging into my driveway. The first officer, a stocky man with a set countenance and a perpetual scowl, cut him off. We received a report of a stolen car that fit this description in the vicinity. Step away from Eric's car. Felt his tummy tighten. His stolen car. It was ridiculous. He had registered and documents inside, yet he understood the game being played here followed a pattern. Skin the luxury car, none of which matched their mental picture of who belonged here. I kept my ID and registration in the glove compartment. Eric said. He kept his voice quiet, even though he felt his irritation rising inside. Keeping your hands where I could see them, the second officer hissed. Simmering helps. Still on his holstered revolver, he moved closer handwise to the house as Sarah emerged at the front door, the warm glow of the porch light casting a soft halo surrounded Eric's anxious face. She called out what was happening. Her voice carried nervousness. Then Sarah. Eric answered. Though the first officer found it difficult to breathe due to the stress in his chest, he tried to seem encouraging. He stepped forward, driving Eric against the automobile with such force that the sharp edge of the door frame pierced his side. Agony shot as the officer pressed harder, his breath hot and hostile in Eric's ear. You believe you're beyond the law. You could simply drive whatever car you choose, anywhere you wish. The cop to snarled his knee into Eric's leg, so as to hard for him to relocate. This is my car. Eric gritted out. My house. My children are here. Be quiet, the officer said, growled, reaching for his shackles, not waiting for a reply from the second officer's arm twisting behind Eric's back. Porch. Sarah's desperate voice sliced through the turmoil. This is his automobile. Home. What are you doing neglecting her? The cops pushed. Eric ground the concrete, which felt hard and cold against his cheek as they. Eric felt his arms wrenched behind him, metal cuffs stinging into his wrists. Breath caught in his throat. He was a very highly skilled, successful attorney who had just spent the day battling police corruption, was being handled as a criminal in front of his own house before his family, his kids, were observing. their small faces pressed against the glass. Eric's heart plummeted. What would they? Imagine how they could grasp this. He was no more just their father now. Police, he was another black male in a beautiful automobile stopping at Target. Sarah yelled a mistake heading at them, but the cops didn't give a damn. Pulled Eric from the ground, his arms trapped behind him as agony shot over. One of the cops gave Sarah a quick glance and then turned back inside. His shoulders. "Ma'am, or you would be next." Sarah, frozen terror and anger mixed on her face as she retreated, her eyes locked with Eric's in a mute, desperate cry. Then the cops pushed Eric toward the police. Although his legs felt as like they could buckle at any minute, he pushed himself to remain tall so he wouldn't be giving them. Seeing him break, this makes one happy. Eric said one again, his error. Voice horror, but consistent. Check my ID, my registration. They are in the glove compartment. I am an attorney and this is my house. But his words were ignored. One of the cops unlocked the rear door of the squad car, pushed him inside, the door slamming closed behind him. Through the tinted window, the car's cold antiseptic inside seemed like a cage. Eric watched Sarah standing by the curb with her palm across her lips, her body shaking. Shock and incredulity followed when the porch light softly illuminated behind her, yet all the warmth had emptied from the evening. It was now weighted coldly with injustice. When the police car turned away, Eric's head spun. He had spent years carefully constructing a life of success. He had battled relentlessly for justice, to alter the very structure that now handled him like nothing more than a criminal. His thoughts ran over all the cases he had won, the changes he had instituted. Battled not when his skin tone dominated, now when none of it seemed to matter. Everything else. The trip to the police station was protracted, and silent Eric's body was biting into his wrists while seated in the back metal cuffs. Although the rough treatment helped with hurting, the biggest pain was the one that passed through his soul, the suffering of knowing his family had seen everything. His children would remember this evening for the rest of their lives, and deep down, a flickering of rage started to burn for everyone who had experienced this before, not just for himself. These days, everyone fights. This was not only his battle. Who has ever been assessed based more on their color than on their behavior? When the police car did eventually stop at the station, the doors opened. Eric understood that this was merely the beginning of the severe police slamming. This was far from done. Car door echoed across the empty station parking lot. Eric sensed the cuffs tightening around his wrists as the cop jerked him forcibly from the rear seat, disregarding the flash of agony that shot. The frigid night air struck his face through his arms, yet it had little effect to calm the. Every breath he took was heavy, tainted with the fire burning inside him. The bitterness of the injustice he had just experienced loomed ahead at the station. Strong fluorescent lights highlight Eric's feet on the concrete steps. Dragged as the police held him inside, their grasp on his arms uncompromising, he might sense the curious lacing of the steps of passing officials. He showed them contempt, but he was only another black man in the suspect list. Handcuffs. The fact that he was an attorney, a man who had spent his career advocating justice, was useless. Here they shoved him through the doors. Eric's head whirled back to his family, Sarah's eyes full of tears, the fearful expressions on his children, the picture of their young hands pressed against the window as they saw their father being treated by the police, shot a sharp pang through his chest. What were they thinking? How could he ever tell them this? Because right now Eric was powerless in the police station. To concentrate on the present, the cops threw him into a little poorly lit processing chamber where the low buzz of fluorescent lights mixed with the antiseptic disinfection smell causes the door to click. Closed behind them, Eric stood before a large counter facing still another apathetic officer seated at a computer, neglected to pay attention to. Look up calmly, pounding away on the keyboard as though this were just another menial chore under his night identity. Officer droned, still not staring. Eric tightened his jaw, controlling the need to snap out Eric Brooks. The officer's fingers stopped over the keyboard for a brief flash of identification in his eyes before his face rapidly returned to one of used indifference. Eric knew that name had significance, particularly in legal. Having worked on cases, he had been a strong supporter for police reform. objected to racial profiling and too much force tonight in this station. His name was only another word in a structure meant to silence voices like. Finally looking up at the arresting officials, his charges, the officer asked. One of the arresting police expressed suspicion of grand theft auto while grinning. Car fit Eric's blood-boiling description this. His house was his car. The whole arrangement seemed ridiculous, but as there was never space for reason when prejudice had already rendered its decision. The officer behind the counter murmured, filling in the data without. As Eric observed the simplicity with which his rights and dignity were reduced to nothing more than following what seemed like a lifetime, bureaucratic keystrokes on a screen sent him farther into the station past rows of. Every stride inside the frigid, sterile, air-filled holding chambers made the air denser. Men of all ages and colors sat or stood in several degrees of discomfort, some sharply angry, others lost in hopelessness. Eric saw their eyes on him, a mixture of sympathy and apathy, as though he were simply another statistic included into the never-ending cycle of arrests, and arrested the cops to an empty cell at the end of the row. They unlocked the iron bar's clang and pushed him inside without saying, hollow closing after him. Finality, the scream rang through the still area, engulfing Eric's ears like a death. Now stood for a time of intense breathing, trying to recover. His calm. His wrists were raw from the cuffs, his shoulders ached from being twisted behind his back, yet the emotional weight felt. So he sat on the chilly, hard bench running alongside the cell's rear wall and, for the first time that evening, rested his head in his hands. Eric let himself experience the whole scope of what had just happened. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped by the police. He had grown up knowing his skin tone set him out for extra attention, but it was he had been treated first time with such obvious contempt and outright hostility. In front of his family for what? Daring to drive a decent car in his own neighborhood. Hood's mind flew to attempt to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be discovered in a system long ago forsaking justice for power. It was not only about him, but also about every black man who had ever been detained without reason, every child who had seen their father hauled away before their own house. The law that Eric had battled so valiantly to preserve now felt like a weapon pointed straight forward. Hours went by while it felt like days. The silence of the cell was disturbed only by the sporadic shuffle of footfall or the far distance clink of keys. Eric's mind returned to Sarah and the children, asking if they were secure, then all good. Hated that they had to watch this. To see personally the violence of a system they were meant to rely upon. How could he ever show his children how to persuade them that everything will be all right when even time went on and weariness started to affect him, started to settle in Eric's back against the cold wall, staring at the flickering light above him? His thoughts kept running over the events of the evening, over and over the flashes, lights, the cops' aggressive SH, as if he were a threat, and the way they had dropped him to the ground. Features of his children, those naive, confused expressions that had charred his. Suddenly, recollection sent the sound of footfall echoing down the hall. Eric's heart rate accelerated as he heard the keys jangling, the cell door open. Then the earlier officer. Among the men who had arrested him stood one with folded arms across his face. Unreadable, Brooks muttered. Eric's brow wrinkled. What, you're free to go? Documents examined. The officer shrugged dismissively, as if it had all had a small misinterpretation, but it was a breach of a somewhat different nature. Overt act of bigotry and aggression masquerading as normal police operation. Jay's blood flowed angrily, but he would have to restrain himself to be cool. There would be a later on. Eric had to come home to his family without another word. Time for it later on. And maintained his head high while leaving the cell. His body ached from the hours of seated in the small area. No matter how much they tried, he wouldn't let them see him damaged as they escorted him back through the station. The cop who had handled his arrest stood there, his expression somewhat more as they got to the front desk. Wary than before. We apologize for the error, the officer mumbled, avoiding Eric's eyes. Eric responded, nothing. There was nothing to tell guys like him. The damage already done. Gathered his possessions, his phone, wallet, keys to his own automobile, left the house. stationed the weight of the night still falling over him like a thick blanket. Outside, the air was clear, and Eric looked at the city as the early morning hours brought stillness over it. His phone showed the texts from Sarah's anxiety seeping through the screen. He texted her back indicating he was returning home, but as Eric ascended into knowing this wasn't over his mind, he drove away from the station. From the moment the cops dropped him to the ground, their callousness, disrespect for his rides based just on their naive assumption of guilt. The color of his skin, this was about every black guy who had ever been falsely targeted, every innocent man and woman compelled to go through the same humiliation. Eric had spent his career battling for justice, but now he understood. He knew the war was far from finished, and he couldn't allow them get away with what they had done. As he drove back toward his house, toward his family, Eric vowed to himself he would not relax until every one of them, officials, everyone who felt they could treat him or anyone else like that, was held. Not only did accountable justice represent something he battled in court, but it also demanded elsewhere. His life, and currently more than ever he was resolved to ensure it was. Eric pulled into his driveway. The gentle sun was starting to rise. Morning light should have been a gentle glimmer over his neighborhood's calm streets. It should have been calm sight, the type of scene that comforts one following a protracted night, but for Eric, the stillness simply added to the weight of what had happened in the police station, with the handcuffs, the cold metal of the detention cell, everything yet fresh in his head, the sting of like a brand. Sarah was waiting for him on the other side, injustice scorching into his ideas. Front porch, her arms crossed with concern showing every line of her face, she hurried down the steps, eyes searching Eric's face for any indication of damage. "Were you good?" inquired her voice, kind but firm, as though worried about what he could say. "I'm good," Eric answered, though the words sounded hollow physically. He was not hurt, but he could still feel the weight of the emotional toll far more than anything else. Officers' hands on him, the manner they had dropped him to the ground like he was nothing. Sarah caressed his arm softly, seeking his gaze. The children, they omitted. Eric closed his eyes. The shame. They were up all night wondering if he would be okay. Buried him hard. His children had seen him at his lowest, defenseless and powerless against a system meant to bring him down, had always wished to shield children from the cruel facts of life, but suddenly that world had invaded their life, unwelcome and harsh. "I will talk to Eric about this." He gently kissed Sarah's forehead, giving her a little fake smile before entering the house. Eric felt the instant he passed the threshold. The house was quiet. Weight of the night settles back onto his shoulders, and Eric felt the strain in the Maya and Air Jordan, their young innocent eyes bulging with uncertainty and dread, peered out from behind the staircase. Dad. Jordan's voice was small, unsure, and the knowledge of the anxiety woven in his son's words hurt Eric. Eric knelt down and opened his arms. The children hurried to him to wrap their little arms around his neck, their bodies quivering slightly. "It's good, Eric here," muttered, keeping the youngsters near. Yet even as he said the words, he knew were insufficient. How could he convince his children, whose everything would be well, even though he himself wasn't sure? Eric turned back after a few moments, gazing into their tear-filled eyes. "What happened last night? It was inappropriate." He started gently, carefully selecting. Sometimes individuals evaluate others with his comments based on irrelevant factors like their skin tone. That's what determines things. "Happened to you? Why did they take you, Maya?" Your voice hardly above a whisper. "You didn't do anything wrong." Eric battled back the lump in his throat with forced swallowing. "They made a mistake, but I'll see to it the youngsters understand that." Stared at him bewildered, but trusted. Eric realized they lacked complete understanding what had happened, and in a way he was appreciative. They were still too young to bear the whole weight of the world's. Shortly after Sarah, Eric's settling of the children in the living room, made his way to his home office. The instant he closed, the weight of the night firmly pressed down on his shoulders from the door behind him like an anchor, his thoughts running back over every time the flashing lights, the yelling, the shackles, the way the cops had discounted his rights as if they didn't matter now. It was about everyone, not just him. Hugh, who had been unfairly singled out, every life broken by Years of the same systematic bigotry that had resulted in Eric's incarceration had passed, advocating justice in the courtroom, but today the struggle had come to him personally. Front door, and he grabbed his phone since he couldn't simply walk away from it, browsing his contacts till he came upon the number he was seeking. Though inside a storm was building, hands were firm, he called the number of his. Eric arrived sleepy after working with another attorney on multiple police misconduct cases. Early on the other side of the line, voice calls. Eric inhaled deeply. "We should discuss what happened last night. I was arrested there, and there was a pause on the other end followed by a sharp intake of air. What the devil are you?" Referring to, Eric rapidly reported the events of the previous evening, the erroneous arrest, the physical attack. The hours his colleague listened in a frigid jail, without any justification. Startled stillness, the weight of the circumstances settling in with every syllable. "This is significant. If we play this right now, it might blow," his colleague eventually said. "The lid off the entire department. We have been awaiting something like this high-profile case revealing their corruption." Eric knew his friend was correct. This went beyond his own personal knowledge. This presented an opportunity to highlight the structural issues inside the police. But even as he saw the chance, a strong feeling of anxiety crept into his gut as he pursued the cops, particularly since, as a black guy, risky it would place him and his family in the crossfire of a system known to be retaliatory against those who questioned it. Eric remarked, "I want this not about me. Firm, this is more than what we require to ensure nobody suffers suffering." Alternatively, his colleague reassured him, "We will bring this before court, and I will make sure the media learns about it. Once this is public, the department won't have a decision." But to answer, Eric nodded despite the nervousness still noted at him. He knew this was the correct course of action, but it didn't make it any less. The hazards were, the expense maybe considerably more. Still, there was. Later that day, Eric sat at his lawyer's office analyzing the no turning back now legal documents they were getting ready to submit. Had already contacted his colleague, a local news station journalist, and the narrative was starting to gather momentum. The police agency, under public indignation, released a nebulous comment regarding looking inside, but Eric knew better than to believe they would attempt to sweep things under the rug. But he was not going to allow them engage in the upcoming court fight. Would be arduous and demanding, but Eric was ready. He had spent his entire battling for others, and today he was fighting for every person who had, as well as for himself, had been victimized by the media coverage that hourly news outlets were increasing, picking up the narrative, presenting it as yet another instance of racial injustice amongst the police across the state. Eric's name started to become connected with the struggle for police reform, and although it made one proud, it also brought growing. Over the next 3 weeks, the level of investigation was a swirl of depositions, interviews, and every day Eric felt the weight of public expectation become more apparent. Larger, but the worst aspect was going back to the courtroom, not as an advocate for others, but as a victim of the same system he had dedicated his career. Challenging the trial itself was nothing more than a show, the courtroom packed with public servants and reporters, activists, all keen to see how the case unfolds, would show the cops engaged in Eric's detention their faces. Their lawyers spun a story that portrayed Eric as the aggressor, a black man driving a luxury but passive automobile, behaving strangely in an area he didn't live in, belong. But the truth cannot be buried under convoluted language and legal jargon. Tales as the proof was shown video of the arrest, witness testimony from onlookers and neighbors started the narrative the cops had intended to build. Starting to, the facts clearly showed Eric had been unlawfully arrested, focused just on the color of his skin. As the experiment developed, the stress in the courtroom, Eric's testimony was striking, describing every moment of that evening, the anxiety, the fury, the helplessness he experienced. Felt his dignity stripped away in front of his hurled to the ground family, and when he mentioned his children's forced witnessing of their father being treated like a criminal, the courtroom descended into a severe silence. The decision, when it at last arrived, swift and forceful. The officers were found guilty of misbehavior, And although the agency was directed to reimburse Eric and his family with damages, Eric knew it was simply the start. Many others like him still exist who had been wronged by the system and never got the opportunity to exact revenge. In the days following the trial, Eric became a major player in the push for police reform as his narrative connected with people all throughout the nation, launching demonstrations and calls for responsibility. For Eric, the fight was far from over. He had battled systematic injustice, but the combat against it was still raging when Eric stood on the courtroom steps surrounded by fans and reporters. Sarah Jordan Maya's family was there, out at the faces of the individuals gathered to stand alongside him. Eric took a long breath, smiling with joy at all they had gone through together. Then he weight of the moment falling over him. The cost of justice had been great, but he was ready to pay this price repeatedly for the future he desired to create for his family and others. For each individual who has ever been quieted by the system. As he left the podium courthouse steps, Eric understood his battle was only just, and it wasn't finished. Starting from the finish. Thank you for viewing. Subscribe to our channel and push the bell to avoid missing fresh stories. We have many fascinating events ahead of us, and other movies already await you with fascinating stories and surprising twists. Ed leaves a comment and indicates where you spotted this video. Disclaimer: this channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.